I'm Elain Baumgardt. I grew up in this area. My maiden name was Blaine. Lived here until Bill and I married in '52, and then we lived in New Brunswick, New Jersey, Madison, Wisconsin, and State College, Pennsylvania, before we moved back to Lafayette. In the early '60s, and that was when we were at the University of Wisconsin, I made baby quilts for Bill's graduate students who had their first babies with us, and they were made from kits. Then when we moved to Pennsylvania in the late '60s, a little church lady came to our newcomer group to show us how to make a quilt block, and I went home and made my first full-size quilt. Then we moved back to Lafayette in '80, and in the Lafayette Journal and Courier was an article about how the courthouse was going to celebrate its 100th birthday. And I had just been to my first quilt seminar in Hilton Head, South Carolina with Ginny Beyer. And so I came home wanting to practice what I had learned. I went down to the courthouse with my camera. Didn't want the courthouse laying on my bed, but what I found was that they had the awfulest colors in the courthouse. Underneath each stairway was a row of these turquoise things and a row of these things, and they were either in this color or yellow or hot pink. And I've always referred to this as my gaudy quilt because they're not colors I would have chosen, but that's what was in the courthouse. Some of these brown stars or leaves were carvings on the doors. We have the shapes of the windows, and the quilting design here is the wrought iron elevator. And again, that's my gaudy quilt. This was my first wall hanging, and it came about the same time as my courthouse quilt. It was things I wanted to practice that I had learned at the seminar. I love doing the birds, and my birds are solid embroidery stitches with just rows and rows of outline stitch. The early ones, I did my birds on the background, but I found that I worked so tight that it would pucker the fabric. So the last several birds that I have made, I actually do the bird on a piece of scrap muslin, cut it out and applique it wherever I want it. Every stitch of my quilts are done by hand, every stitch. The sewing machine never touches mine. I pre-shrink all the fabrics before I start out, and some of these have been washed since they've been finished, but I always claim that my things are washable. And at our house, we use them and we wash them. Okay, this one's the frozen custard. Now, we grew up eating frozen custard. When we moved back to Lafayette, we actually lived too close to the frozen custard. We were there several times a week. The frozen custard was opened in '32 by the Kirchhoffs. Their sons, the Lotties, now own it. It's at the corner of Wallace and Main Street, and my favorite window was always the cone window where Eleanor dipped the cones. Eleanor's window was right there, but I couldn't get her in that little spot, and I wasn't sure whether she'd appreciate my making a wall hanging and putting her picture on there. So Eleanor has her own personal little window. She's on the back in her own little window. When I finished it, I thought, if she objects to that, I will never show it. So I took it to the frozen custard first and showed it to her, and she thought it was wonderful. So it's been hauled around a lot of places. In fact, one place that trip that it made was to El Paso, Texas. And our grandchildren at that time were in the 1st and 3rd grade. And we were told that we have to go talk to our grandkids' classmates. And what could we take along, or what could we talk? Well, we were told we could talk about anything we wanted. So I took along this wall hanging, and after we returned home, the students were all made to write us thank you notes. And 90% of them said, we liked Eleanor best. So, this is one of two. It's my second, what I call my protest piece. You can see here, this was one of Dave Sattler's cartoons. Dave gave me permission to copy that, and he autographed it for me. I am from Greater Lafayette. I'm not from Lafayette, West Lafayette, or Purdue University, as the name and all the advertising was changed to. I grew up out in the county. I still own property in the county, and I am from Greater Lafayette. So that's my protest piece, and I took a piece of a border print, cut out different silhouettes, and put it around the edge. My farmhouse is there. The Quilter's Harvest out in Shadeland is there. It was the Grange Hall when I was growing up. Got someplace from Prophetstown, Fort Wyattnot, do have the courthouse and the bell tower from Purdue, and Westminster, where we live now. Well, this one, I wanted to make the trees. I don't very often piece because I don't like to piece. Most of my things are applique and then with a lot of embroidery embellishment. But I wanted to make the trees on a wall hanging, and at that time, President Bush was planting trees everywhere, and he was knocking broccoli. He said, if I'm the president and I don't want to eat broccoli, I will not eat broccoli. So my first thought was, I'll call this Plant a Tree but Bury the Broccoli. But then Barbara said a few things I liked. So down the side, on this side, are quotes from Barbara Bush, and on this side are quotes from George Bush. And then he planted a tree in Indianapolis for Ryan White, the AIDS victim. And then there's Millie, the dog. Most people say, how do you get this writing down the side? Well, I use what is called hardanger fabric. It's an even weave used for Scandinavian type embroidery. I based it on the border. I don't use a cross stitch, I use a back stitch, but it's the same thing. It's a counted work. And so I count all those little stitches, write whatever I want to write on there. And then when I'm finished, I pull the hardanger fabric out both directions, and my writing is left on the piece that I'm working on. Okay. This one was done in '89 when the residents on 9th Street, the historical district in Lafayette, decided to bring out the flags that different residents had in their possession and hang them, call it their festoon forth. And many of my things, in fact most of them, are done because I read an article in the newspaper, which sparks my interest or inspires me or something. Anyway, that's how we started on this one. This traditional pattern is called Lafayette's Orange Peel. And in a lot of mine, I take a traditional pattern, take out the center, and put a picture in it. That is the Historical Society building on 9th Street. Each of these flags hung on 9th Street. Above each flag is written the name of the flag. Below it is the address at which it hung. On the back, if I can't or don't wish to put everything on the front, I type on a piece of muslin and sew it to the back. On the back here, I have the same addresses as under each of the flags, but I have the name of the person who either owned the flag or lived at the address where the flag was displayed. Okay. This quilt was done when they stripped those gaudy colors off of the courthouse and finished it in natural wood. And I call this my elegant quilt as opposed to the gaudy quilt. I actually put the courthouse in the center here. I used some of the same designs. These were the turquoise on the first quilt, and these were the yellows and blues on the first quilt. It looks here like there's more stuffing than just the batting in the quilt, and there is. I've done what's called trapunto, or Italian quilting, and through all the channels that I have made on the back of this quilt, I have taken a darning needle and pulled yarn through all those channels. Now, when I quilt, people will say, "Let me see your hands. You don't have calluses and you don't have bloody fingers." No, I don't wear a thimble, and I don't quilt like everybody else does. I do not make a running stitch. There is such a thing as a stab stitch, but if you look for directions for making a stab stitch, you push up with one hand and down with the other and do each stitch separately. Well, I do each stitch separately, but to make sure that I've got my stitches as straight on the back as they are on the front, I use this finger to guide the needle up, and this arm does all the work. Every stitch is done one at a time on my things, with this arm doing all the work. This one, and though we haven't seen the church where I grew up yet, this is sort of giving my husband equal time. He grew up in St. James Lutheran Church and school, went to school there from 1st to 8th grade. And on this particular one in 1999, these were things around the city of Lafayette. In each instance, somebody has autographed it. Pastor May was the pastor at that time. He autographed it. He has moved on. The minister at Federated has changed jobs. My eye doctor has changed his sign. Mr. Rumpsa has died. I think that Bob Mertz still probably lives at the address where the Christmas tree is lit up, even in the summertime. Arnie has passed away. The Miller's Fish is no more. The mayor has changed, so his signature is different, and Columbian Park sign is different. They won't let you go down the curly Q slide like when I was little, and the parks director has changed. Now, this star here is not a religious symbol. I needed some place to put the sheriff's autograph. Dave Murtaugh was sheriff at that time, and of course he's moved on too. But so I gave him a star, put him over the church. But his mother was Bill's and Mai's English teacher when we were in high school, so I wanted his autograph on my quilt also. Okay, this is the state flower. As we go around the room, you'll see we have the state bird, we have the state tree, and we have the state flower. It's the peony, and I love those old-fashioned dark red peonies. The piece itself of the peony is just one piece that I've cut out, but then, like in many of my things, I have just embroidery embellished them so that they look more like the peony than just the shape. Do also have the state bird on this one. It's very heavy because for some reason or other I used a very heavy batting in this one, so it's very heavy. Most of my quilts, the large ones, I make full size that go all the way to the floor, thinking that if someone someday wants to use them on a queen size or a king size bed, they can put a dust ruffle on and they'll still work. We use our quilts, and when one sort of wears out, we throw it aside and make another one. Okay, this is the first time I've ever shown this many, but also the first time I've ever put prices on them. and about half of them in here do have a price on them this time. I have done some commissioned work in the past, but when I've been displaying them other places, they've always been not for sale. This one I understand the city of West Lafayette is going to hang somewhere when the show is over. This is the logo for the West Lafayette Farmers Market, and we live a block and a half from that market, so we've given up our garden on the farm. We figure we'll let somebody else do it for us. We live at Westminster, so when you pull out of Westminster's main gate on Farmers Market Day, you see this sign going one direction, it says garden party ahead, and going the other direction, it says eat your veggies. So that's just a little piece sort of celebrating the farmer's market. Okay, maybe I should say right here, because this is another question that people often ask, is how many have you made? Every stitch is by hand, and over the years I have made more than 30 double bed size or larger quilts and over 60 wall hangings. Where do you keep them? Well, they're in the pie safe and in the closet and some on the walls. This particular one, back in high school in 1949, a friend's parents asked me to serve at their wedding anniversary. And they gave me, for doing that, a handkerchief that had the map of Lafayette on it. It had never come out of the cedar chest. It was in the bottom of the cedar chest in a box. Then several years ago, I met a quilter from Denver, and some years later she sent me this stamp, and she said, when I was a college student in Colorado, my aunt sent me a letter that had that stamp on it, and it says Lafayette, Indiana. So she said, I thought you should have it. So I put it in the closet, and it laid in the closet for a long time. And then another thing I haven't mentioned is that all of these with stories have their own scrapbook, where the pictures I've taken and the stories I've read in the newspaper. I have a scrapbook for each. I did not have a scrapbook for this one because it was just a way of getting rid of that stamp and that and that handkerchief. And then I had a show at Lafayette Savings Bank in '98, and Dr. Schulte came to the show, and he got so excited because he had been instrumental in getting the stamp issued. So he gave me all his memorabilia, so it also has a scrapbook. Okay, this one hung last year at Fair Oaks Dairy up in the northern part of the state for the summer. I've always wanted to do old gray barns. I like the old gray barns. So this is it's a new day, and my bird here happens to be a rooster out there crowing. This is the visitor center at Fair Oaks Dairy. This is my barn, this is a friend's barn, and this is a friend's barn. The other barns were just barns we spotted driving down the highway, and I would yell, whoa, wait a minute, there's a good barn. So the other barns, they all have the address where I found these barns underneath them. What looks like machine stitching here is not. It's handmade buttonhole stitch all the way around. What looks like French knots here is not actually French knots, but everywhere I saw a little yellow flower on this background fabric, I made what's called a candle wicking knot. And I use candle wicking knots as opposed to French knots, because a French knot knots up lots of times before you get it where you want it, and then you have to cut the thread and start over because you cannot take it out. But a candle wicking knot, I can put it exactly where I want it, and it stays there. Some people have asked where I found the fabrics that look like barn boards. I couldn't, so I used just a gray fabric and I drew all those lines and did all the shading with a permanent pen. This one was my first really story quilt, and it's not Bill's favorite, and and yet it gets an awful lot of attention. Other people like it. It's more folk artsy than anything else, but this was my first attempt. There was an article in the Journal and Courier, and it had a picture of this tractor and this fellow right here on it, and it said that Chester Sterrett, who helped organize and start the Steam and Gas Power Show in Battleground, had died. And this year, 1987, when they had the show, they were going to take all of his tractors and engines to the Steam and Gas Power Show, and then in August they would be auctioned off. So this was to be the last show. I went with the idea that I would take designs, you know, different tire shapes and that, and I'd make something like that first courthouse quilt. But we sort of got carried away. I mean, I got carried away. And these were tractors. They're not near all of his, but these were tractors that were in the show, that were the Sterretts. I don't like weeds in my farm fields, so this is my soybeans, and this is my soybeans, this is my wheat, this is my corn, and this weedy patch here is my government set aside. The first time I showed this, I met Mrs. Sterrett, the widow, and the daughter-in-law. And I had to ask, because I couldn't tell in the newspaper article if he had a beard. So I had sort of a shadow or a beard on this guy down here. And I asked the daughter-in-law, I said, I just have to ask you, does your husband have a beard? And she said no. And so I went home that night and I cut it off. And then I called her and said, I shaved your husband tonight. Another time when I showed it out in the Battleground area, there was a family waiting to talk to me because they said, we can understand everything else on here, but whose house is that? And they didn't recognize the house. And I said, that's nobody's house. I just needed a house in that corner, and so I put one there. I hate the heat, and the day I went to the Steam and Gas Power Show, it was 98 degrees, so I've got a thermometer over here on the tree that shows the temperature that day. Again, like most of them, everything I've told you is written on the back on a piece of muslin and sewn on there. This looks like stenciling, like maybe it's been painted on top, and you'll see that on many of my pieces. This is actually reverse applique, where the letters and numbers here are drawn on the top fabric. And instead of appliquing this lighter color to the top, a piece is sewn to the back, and then the top is cut away and the edge is turned under. So it's a reverse applique. Okay, this was another article in the Lafayette Journal and Courier. I grew up out in Union Township, and Farmers Institute Quaker Church is in Union Township. So there was an article in the newspaper saying that the old church was needing repair, and they were trying to raise money. So I went out to see what I could come up with to make a wall hanging. This traditional pattern here, and then I've used it again in the center, is called Harrison's Rose. I've taken the center out and put my picture in there. But the settlers brought with them Harrison's Rose, Bouncing Bet, and Lilacs. The names down the sides are the names by which the church has been called over the years. One of the settlers wrote this poem. What's written down this side is what you would have on the historical sign. And these names over here are the actual members in 93, I guess, when I bought it. It stands in an oak grove. This one is just a little experiment to see if I could make a three-dimensional rose and to see if I could use the metallic thread on my hummingbird. I did, and I've never made another one because it's miserable to work with. It breaks after 2 or 3 stitches, and then you have to start over. So that's just a little pretty little piece that was an experiment. Okay, this one is the Indiana tree, the tulip tree. The blossoms here are just one piece of fabric, and then I've done all the embroidery embellishment to make them look like blossoms. Here, where it looks like the leaves have additional stuffing in them, they do. They have that Italian trapunto quilting, where I have taken the yarn on a darning needle and pulled yarn through all those channels. All right, this one would have been we have 4 grandchildren, and this one would have been grandchild number 4 had it been a boy. The first 3 were boys, and we wanted a girl so bad that I made one that really looked girlish and one that really looked boyish, and we got the girl, so this became a wall hanging. I had a little wooden picture growing up that had a picture very similar to this. In fact, our grandson in El Paso has that on his wall. My husband Bill had Guernsey cattle, so I've got a Guernsey cow there. The traditional pattern that I used is called Indiana's Puzzle. I particularly like this one. It sort of stands out. The colors didn't really go with maybe the rest of the exhibit so well, but I like this one. This is one of my favorites. And I always said, I figured growing up, I thought the mailman gave me that little picture. Now my guess is somebody else did, but the mailman delivered it, you know. So as a kid, I thought the mailman gave it to me. Okay, this was done when we got home from our trip to Alaska. I had always wanted to go to Alaska, and in 2000 we did, so this is my Alaska one. This one is about the new magazine in town called Helen, for local people or people of the area, and really women a little bit younger than I am. But anyway, I happen to know the 2 girls that started the magazine. So I did a wall hanging sort of in honor of them. The words here, I'm a woman, came from a Peggy Lee song of the 1950s. She had a song called I'm a Woman, and the little old woman, she did the shopping, the cleaning, the laundry, and the cooking. So I've got those little ladies here in the corner. In the center, I've got today's lady, and she's got her high heel shoes and her briefcase. Only somebody here the other day informed me that's not her briefcase, that's her laptop. Okay, so it's her laptop and her Helen magazine under her arm. And these are the colors that today's generation uses. That's the colors that they have in the Helen magazine office. Our son in El Paso has a similar type business. That's the colors in his offices. So that's today's colors. Sharon Woodson and, or Susan Woodson and Sharon Martin, the owners of the magazine, have autographed that one for me. And this is probably my favorite one because this is my story. When my mother passed away in 2002, she still owned her family's farm, the Runyon Farm out on 300 South in Wayne Township. My sister and I sold it when she passed away, and they have demolished these buildings, and these should be demolished, and I'm sure they will in time, but that's what I remember. That was Grandma's house, and it was still there in 2002. This is my dad's family's farm where I grew up. The house is different because it burned after I had left home, but I still own that farm. That one's on 200 South. Then I grew up at Stidham Methodist Church, and this is the way the church looked when I was growing up there. Today, of course, it has a fellowship hall and some additions on it, and looks a little different. The other things are things that I remember growing up and at Grandma's. I did this in 2002, so I took some time and thought about it. This is a harness maker's bench that had belonged, I think, to my grandfather's brother. He was a harness maker. A couple of the homes that we owned, we had that harness maker's bench in it, and with a pot of flowers sitting on top of it. And our son's in El Paso now with a saddle on it. This came out of Grandma's attic above the garage. It also is in El Paso, and it sits in their family room with a doll in it. I remember our stove looking like that, our washing machine like that. It was in the basement. You carried the water down, did the laundry, carried the water back up, threw it underneath the fence outside. This is my dad on his John Deere tractor, and I know it's my dad, even though he's in a local photography book here in town. They don't have the names of the people in it, but I have the original picture, so I know that was him. I like the red-winged blackbirds, the barn swallows. This was the well house at Grandma's. It's set on the other side of this building right here. And Grandma let us girls make mud pies out on the other side. This was my 4-H pig. In my day in 4-H, you had to be in the boys club you had to have a boys project, like an animal, to be in the boys club. And my friends and I decided that we would get into the boys club. So I took a pig, but I only took it for 1 year. It wasn't worth the effort. We had a milk separator in the basement, which I remember turning. Took some getting used to eating store-bought cottage cheese or ice cream because we had our own. We had the hollyhocks that were alongside of the cob shed. My grandfather had bees. We had chickens, which I hated to, gather the eggs because they would pick you on the back of the hand. We had a pump like that. This was the water boys for the threshing crew. They lived on the farm behind us, and they would make sure that they did the threshing at our house at the end of a week, and then they would leave the pony over the weekend for us. This was my dad on his one-legged stool milking the cow, and there's the cat sitting waiting for him to squirt a little bit her way. And this is the barn having hay put in. This is me right here because I usually got the job, which was my favorite, to trip the rope to let the hay fall into the hay mound. So that's probably my favorite line. Okay, this one is for the grandson who lives in El Paso, grandchild number 3. This traditional pattern right here is called Texas Tears. I bought a tile from the Santa Fe Tile Company once, and it looked like this, but I added a roadrunner, a coyote, and a hummingbird and a face on the moon. The first 2 grandchildren have sampler quilts, so they're what I call family blocks are on the front, are one of the blocks on the front of their quilt. The last 2, this was one of them, and then the other one, they were not sampler quilts, but I wanted to put the family blocks on. So their family blocks are on the back. This is Bill's and my family, and this quilt would belong to Don's son. And then this would be Don's family, Don and his wife, Carol, and the owner of this quilt is here with his sister listed here. And I have family blocks like that on all all four of the grandkids' quilts. Okay, this one is simply the state bird. Again, the birds are done with just rows and rows of 2 strands of embroidery floss done just as close together as you can get them. When I do some shading or go from one color to the next, I use 1 strand of each color. In here, probably there are thousands of candle wicking knots because the seeds are made with 1 strand of embroidery floss done in candle wicking knots. This is the last train on 5th Street. It was Amtrak 291, and at the corner of 5th and Main, of course, stands the metal sculpture. And when the last train came through, they gave them suitcases and a sign saying the last train on 5th Street. This happened on July the 22nd, 1994. These quilted corners are the logos that they used on little pamphlets for celebrations and that. And then in 2001, when they actually ran the train down to Market Square, and I guess we're going to try, immediately following that, tear up the track, so there was no question but what that was the last train. They had this billboard out, and then those who came to see that little celebration, they gave them these red ribbons. Now, when I have said before that my things are washable, they are, but I would not wash that. I don't know what would happen to the ribbons. This one has been purchased by someone who had a lot to do with with organizing the railroad relocation. So that one's sold. Okay, this one has a lot of family history on it too. This one was when they tore down the 1-lane bridge going at Granville Bridge. All through town there were signs that said Granville Bridge closed, and I grew up 4 miles from Granville Bridge. So the last night that it was open, I went out to take pictures. And I was gone so long that Bill thought something had happened to me. But when you got out there, if there was one person in the car, they were wanting to get home, and they were irritated by the cars with 3 or 4 that would get on top of the bridge and then stop, I went across the bridge 3 times that night because I'd get in line on one side, get out and take my picture. When it was my turn to go across, I'd turn around, get in line on the other side and come back. So I went back and forth across the bridge 3 times that night. But it also was, in 1988, was also a year of a drought. And the only thing that grew was Queen Anne's lace, chicory, and thistles. Down the sides, if you read that, it'll tell you what the old bridge cost to build it, who built it, what the new bridge cost, who built it, who won the elections that year, what the crop yield was, who was in my bridge group, who we went to the Purdue basketball games with, who won the elections, where our kids live, just a lot of stuff. Okay, this is what I call was my first protest piece. This was when, I don't know, the Historical Society, somebody decided that they needed to do away with the Fiddler's Gathering because it wasn't making money. And so I went to the Fiddler's Gathering to see what all the fuss was about. In the newspaper was a picture of this fella, George Robinette, appeared in the paper about that time. But anyway, I went to the Fiddler's Gathering, and what I found was there were so many people there. Many of them had come from long distances, came back year after year, and they were having such a good time that I didn't see any reason why we needed to get rid of it, the Fiddler's Gathering, because it wasn't really, I don't know, that it was losing money, it just wasn't making money. So anyway, but it's still going on, and that was in '89. Evidently, others came to that same conclusion. And that was my protest piece. This one is my 9/11. This, of course, was the picture of the firemen that appeared in many of the papers. Their names are written below. It looks sort of cloudy or foggy there, and that's because I took a piece of very sheer fabric and sewed over the top after I got my applique done. If you look really close, there's no design to the quilting here. It's called what's called stipple quilting, and it's quilt stitches just as close as you can get them together. And so that is just loaded with stitches, but no particular design. This is the poem that's read at Purdue home football games. I am an American. That's George and President Bush and Laura, and the Pentagon, the Twin Towers, another of my birds. There are 50 stars here and 13 stripes along the side. Now this one is when they moved the depot down to the bottom of Main Street on 2nd and set up Really Plaza. These words here are really song titles, but they're titles to articles in the Lafayette Journal and Courier. Again, I used 2 of Dave Sattler's cartoons when Mayor Really flipped off the light leaving office for the first time, and then both of the mayors over there at West Lafayette and Lafayette. Dave gave me permission to copy them, and then he autographed them for me. Mayor Really autographed this one, and Mayor Marjoram autographed that side. These little things here were designs that they used on programs that they used for different celebrations when Really Plaza was built. Okay, I grew up at Stidham Methodist Church out south of town in the Shadeland area. I'd always wanted to do their stained glass windows, and every so often they'll have another article in the newspaper about Stidham's wonderful stained glass windows. I'm not very good at picking out fabrics that are small prints that look like a solid from a distance. I wanted something that really sort of looked like stained glass, and just a plain solid would not do that. So it took me a while to find what I wanted, but I finally found at a merchandise mall a lady from Elgin, Illinois, who did hand-dyed fabrics, and she had the colors I wanted, and they sort of give you a feeling of stained glass. The black here is just yards and yards and yards of handmade black bias. Picture down here is of Stidham. I have no idea whether that will hold up or not. Back when I made this wall hanging in 96, I guess, you couldn't go to someplace like Walmart or some t-shirt place on the west side of that and get them to transfer a picture. So, but at that time you could buy some sticky, goopy stuff at the hobby shops and transfer a picture. So that's what that is. It's sort of stiff, and I have no idea whether it'll hold up or not.